Hey guys, welcome back to the Magfed Ranch Paintball channel, and today I'm going to be doing another Final Inspect Fridays. But as always guys, right, please subscribe to the channel, smash that like button, right, give me a huge thumbs up, and of course turn on your notification bell. I am posting, consistent content every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. But of course I'm posting for the most part daily, giving you guys hopefully information that is useful to the Magfed community out there. And then of course, lastly guys, obviously watch the whole video, but please share and comment. Please let me know if there's anything you guys want me to shoot videos about. Obviously, I don't have knowledge on everything, but I'm always curious if it's Magfed related, and of course, specifically first strike, firing related markers. Super interested in that aspect, and of course, improving, and as always, hopefully come to a standardization of the Magfed gameplay. Okay, but anyways guys, today's topic for Final Inspect Fridays is going to be different air through buttstock options or in-tank buttstock options. Okay guys, so one thing, obviously as part of your checklist, as part of your setup that you want to go over, maybe plan out, and that will kind of dictate your build as well too, in terms of how you're setting up your marker, specific gameplay, right? Are you going into an event where it's going to be quick, short games, where you can refill your tank in between rounds? Or is it a big scenario game where, you're gonna have to go out in the field? I remember one event that we had to, the field was like, we're talking huge, acres upon acres. And you have to go out there and complete missions. And so hiking back to refill your tank at the starting point was pretty much out of the question. And so, do you run a air through tank setup with a remote line and bigger tank? Or do you run the individual, in-tank setups? Okay, so that's kind of what I want to go over today in terms of some of the pros and the cons, some of kind of what you're gonna expect from that setup, some of the pros and cons as well, and how that might dictate, because this is also another important thing, how I might dictate the rest of your build, right? Whether that's optics, whether that's your loadout, your gear, and everything else. Okay. So let's start out with an in-tank setup. And I have two options for you here today, but guys, of course, there's gonna be many other options out there when you talk about in-tank setup. I wanna eliminate a couple, well, not a couple, but I wanna eliminate one particular in-tank setup, and that is the one where it's not on the back of the receiver, okay? So, for example, like the EMF or the TMC, right? The factory air location, the Stormer is another one that comes to mind, right? It's on the bottom of the grip, right? So they have the air fitting here because the air tube goes up through the grip and up through the receiver here. So what I'm talking about is markers that have the air obviously input on the back of the receiver, like a T15, 468, M17 with the heat core, or of course, if those other markers have been converted to use a rear air setup, right? Okay, so if you have converted those markers to a rear air setup, then this is kind of what I'm talking about. Okay, so I guess I'll start with this one, but this is a T15, right, with the rear ASA setup. I am using the guide rod setup, guys. I prefer the guide rod setup over the new sticker setup. For example, on the new generation T15s, and I believe it started with either Gen 4 or Gen 3, they went to no guide rod. Now granted, this one has a drop-down ASA, so obviously the drop-down ASA eliminates the guide rod feature, but regardless, even then, the new T15s will just have a sticker that you attach to your tank, right? And then that sticker will have the guide for your buttstock, in essence replace the guide rod. So I don't prefer those ones just because the sticker obviously is going to be a one-time use deal. It's going to be stuck, married, to whichever tank you use. And of course, there's a possibility that it can come loose, right? Maybe heat, maybe just, through time and additional wear. It's just a sticker, guys. Eventually the sticker is gonna not stick anymore, okay? So primarily when I discuss a rear in-tank setup, I'm going to talk about a guide rod setup like we have here with the T15. The 468 has something very similar, although it's not screwed in. It's kind of just push button tabbed in right here on the bottom of the ASA here. Or of course like the M17, which is similar to the T15 where it's just screwed on to the bottom of the heat core assembly. Okay guys? And so let's go over the pros real quick with this setup. The pros, first off, what I really love, and actually I prefer this setup based upon gameplay of course, is that your marker is just its own individual component, right? There's no remote line attaching your marker to your body, not attached to a tank of any sort, right? And so the marker is like a real life firearm. It's literally its own thing. You pick it up, you set it down. If you have it on a sling, you drop it down with a sling. There's nothing else attaching the marker to your loadout. And so it just looks clean and it's simple, okay? Speaking of simplicity, obviously one of the pros of this setup too is that you're not adding any additional components, right? Whether that's your tank, the tank to a hose, right, connection with the valve, and of course the line and the quick, connection fittings, whether it's like a quick disconnect like this Pro Connect 3 here, or if it's just going to be your standard, airline connection fitting that works with like this 468 fitting back here. Okay, so less components to go wrong, less components to deal with, okay? So I like that simplicity factor. There's also a snagging, right, issue, right? If you're playing with this line, and the way I used to run it, guys, on my marker, the setup that I used to run this on was obviously my 468, or when I switched to my saw loadout, which was a Takamo kit, pretty much purposely built saw, I would have this tank with a pouch on the back of my back like so, pointed to the right, okay? So that way, because I'm right-handed, I could turn the knob on and off if need be. And of course, having a quick disconnect like this is very useful. But I will get into that when I get into the remote line. But the point, guys, is that with an in-tank setup, you eliminate all that, right? You don't need a pouch, you don't need all this additional stuff. So your loadout is going to be lighter, right? You're not adding all this additional stuff to your gear that you're having to lug around. And like I said, the marker is just super clean, super simple. Now, it is going to add weight to your marker, right? So for example, this is a 10 CI tank I have on here, guys, versus a 13 CI tank. So it's not that much heavier than the air through buffer tube, but it is still going to be slightly heavier, right? It's just a bigger piece of metal. And so the weight is going to be a little bit heavier. And of course, the associated, if you can kind of see here, I mean, the stock that I have on this 468, which by the way, guys, is literally a real, quote unquote, real steel, Magpul stock, right, that you can use on a real rifle. It's going to be, you can see, it just has less plastic, so it's going to be lighter as well. Less metal, less plastic. It's going to be a lighter overall package with just the marker using the air through stock. But because you're adding all the other stuff, the in-tank setup is going to be lighter overall as a loadout. Okay, The other thing too I like is that because you're not having to take the stock in and out, well, you shouldn't, right? Unless you need to service it for whatever reason, and you just have to fill it with the, the fill nipple here on the side. It's easy to kind of just service this marker, right? You need to go and clean it. You don't need to disconnect anything from your gear. Whereas when you play with a remote line setup, you're gonna have to disconnect that connection to put it onto the table. It's just a little bit more inconvenience, okay, guys, with the remote line setup. All right. Another thing that I can talk about that is kind of a pro with the in-tank setup is that because you don't have a remote line attached to your marker, making shoulder switches, right, from a left hand, let's say you're left-handed, right, and then you go to make a shoulder switch to your right hand, or vice versa, right, there's nothing getting in your way. Also, if you have a sling, and you can imagine, right, this is slung on your body, the line that can attach to it can get snagged up on your sling. So that's the other thing as well too. And then of course, just maybe shooting around a barricade, this thing can snag. Now, I'll be honest with you guys, when I used to play with my saw, because I wasn't an assaulter per se, I was obviously the heavy gunner. I didn't really get into positions as much that would include a line snagging. But that being said, I could, there were times in certain positions, maybe I was laying in the prone position, maybe I was crawling through the bushes to sneak up on an enemy, that this thing definitely did get caught sometimes. I 100% remember that at a big game. I remember, I think it was in Chicago that we went to play a big game, and we were pretty much, crawling up a hill to kind of get over, to see over this hill to see if there was any enemies down below. And I remember getting caught on a branch or a log or something like that. And luckily we weren't in an engagement, we weren't in a firefight, but it was definitely a pain in the ass to get myself free. Okay, I had to literally disconnect the line, and then that noise is going to, if we were trying to be silent, that noise was not going to really give us an advantage. Okay, let's talk about the cons real quick with the in-tank setup. So the first thing that jumps to my mind, guys, and this is not in any, by the way, none of these things are in any particular order, but the first thing that jumps to my mind that I've mentioned in other videos is the cheek weld, guys. So as you guys can see here, the in-tank buttstock versus just your regular AR buttstock, you can see how much thicker the in-tank stock is. And so when you're wearing goggles and you go to put up your cheek, right, against the buttstock, it's going to push your face up higher, right? And so that's the reason why we have to use risers on our markers, because of not only the optics needed to be obviously in a position where it's just easier for us to acquire, but primarily it's the combination of the goggles, right? The goggles that we have to wear, and of course an in-tank buttstock setup. Okay, if you're using a air through setup with just your regular buttstock, because it's thinner, you don't have to use as high of a riser. You can probably get away with like a 1.5 inch riser at the minimum versus a 2 to 2.5 inch riser if you have to use an in-tank setup. Okay, so that's the first con that I can think of, guys, is this whole optic riser setup. So like I mentioned, you can see depending on which route you go with your tank setup, it can dictate the rest of your build. The second con is going to be the design of the buttstock itself. Obviously, this one I got from MCS. This one as well is from MCS. So MCS makes several different designs. They make this style, this style. They also make this other style over here. And they also make one more style, which is like almost kind of like, I think it's on our URGI marker over there, but it's pretty much like the Magpul version, but of an in-tank setup. And the problem with some of the designs, but primarily it's this one, I believe this is their standard buttstock design, so I think it's called the SCA. But in essence, it's just their standard buttstock design, like the one I have there on our MR12 marker. And this is the problem. It will literally, if you accidentally engage the adjustment paddle, right, because it's supposed to click, and stop at its individual, each individual adjustment. The problem is if you accidentally click the paddle and it just somehow happens to slide all off, it will slide completely off, okay? And where you run into that issue primarily is, of course, if you're rocking a sling, right? So you can imagine if you're using the sling attachment here that they provide, or let's say you use the slot here to attach a sling on the back of the buttstock, and I know recently this is a very popular point to attach your sling, and for whatever reason, let's say you're carrying it around like this and there's the marker is not being supported by your hands, and the paddle accidentally goes and gets triggered, right? It engages, you can literally lose the paddle completely, right? And then literally your marker is going to fall down, right? It's going to fall down and the sling is pretty much useless at that point, okay? And so that's something to be concerned about with this style of buttstock, okay? With this particular style of in-tank buttstock. Now, the other style that we have here that I wanted to show you guys, and also the other ones as well, I have tested personally, right? So like this one that's on our Honey Badger clone, right? It doesn't have that issue. They made the adjustment just enough to engage the slots on the guide rod. The adjustment, like I said, never gets high enough where it's going to pop out of the adjustment. You have to really forcibly pull this whole section down to get it to come off, all right? That's why we always prefer using some type of rear sling attachment here, like this FS rear sling mount attachment, versus just putting it on the buttstock. Now, like I said, some buttstocks, the other buttstocks don't have that issue, like their standard buttstock. But just in case, right? Just in case, like this one right here as well, you'll see that it'll come off as well. Okay, so you just want to make sure that if you're using the in-tank setup, some of them will slide all the way off when engaged and other ones won't, right? But just to be 100% safe, that's why I don't recommend using these sling mounts, sling provisions on the buttstock. I would prefer using the rear sling mount like we have on our T15s. And of course, even the M17, they have this kind of like this kind of like key ring loop that comes with the M17 marker that you can attach a sling hook on as well too, right? Or just get some other type of attachment, right? Get a Picatinny attachment. There's a bunch that you can get online where you can attach, different sling mounts onto the Picatinny rails and use that instead of the in-tank setup, all right? The other con is going to be air capacity, right? So a 10 CI, 13 CI tank, and of course you can go up to a 17 CI tank, although it's going to stick out the back of your marker a lot more, which is going to make it look unsightly, right? The 17 CI tank sticks out to about here. They still don't have as much capacity as, let's say, a 48, right, or bigger remote line setup tank. And so you're going to be limited in terms of how many magazines you can fire with your marker. Now, on average, a T15 is fairly efficient. It might not be as efficient as some other markers, but you still should be able to get a full loadout, 6 to 8 mags easily. I think you can probably even shoot up to 10 mags with the T15. The M17, of course, is a little bit less efficient, but you can still shoot a standard loadout of 5 to 6 magazines with the M17. So once again, if you're just playing a game, where you're only planning to shoot 5 or 6 magazines, and depending on the marker that you've selected, an in-tank setup is more than sufficient. And then of course, it's just a small field, a small map where you get to play that quick game, and then of course go back out, service your marker, reload the magazines, and then of course air up your marker again. Not a big deal, right? However, if you're playing a huge scenario game, like I said, where some of the games I've been to, they're like acres upon acres of map, of field play, you're gonna be, hours of hiking, before you get to the next air station, or of course, you have to go to the starting point again to get your marker aired up. And so in that particular case, having extra air is definitely convenient and of course useful. Otherwise, right, without air, our marker is pretty much dead, right? We can't fire our markers, so you pretty much just have a dead weight, a bludgeoning device, but this isn't real life, right? We can't use our markers as a bludgeoning device, okay? But there's always, of course, you can say there's always an option of carrying extra tanks. And guys, our team used to do that. I remember one of our teammates would carry a backpack with extra tanks just in case, and extra magazines as well too. So, as a team, that's definitely something that you guys can plan for. But if you're just an individual player, of course, that's going to add to your loadout as well too, right? So now you're having to carry a backpack, extra gear in that backpack. That's going to add weight. And I get it, guys. There's a lot of people that are like, oh, just man up, right? Just carry all that extra weight. But guys, it comes to a point where, that weight's going to get you tired. That weight's going to come into effect if you're playing these huge scenario gameplays. That's why weight, even our real military, weight is such a huge thing they think about when designing and making their loadouts. Okay. All right, guys. Another thing is that the rods can come loose, and like I was telling you guys, the stickers can come loose as well too. And so you might want to carry extra sticker guides, right? You might want to make sure you Loctite all the hardware, and just keep an eye on it and making sure that you're just looking at it in between gameplays so they don't fall out. Okay, guys? Let's go into remote line setups real quick. The remote line setups, of course, Pro is going to be pretty much the opposite of what the in-tank setups. But one of the things a few of the things I need to add is, one, with the remote line setup and the buffer tube setup here, like this, right? You're not going to have that, you see that issue of the buttstock coming out? You're not going to get that, because this is literally like a real AR setup where it's not going to literally just slide off. So mounting a sling attachment to these points on the buttstock is workable with this setup. And so that can, obviously give you another attachment point compared to the back of here where, you need to use an attachment point here. And then the other thing too, guys, is there is way more options with the different buttstocks available when you use a buffer tube setup, right? Because literally you can use pretty much any AR buffer tube. The in-tank ones, they had to make specifically for the tank. And so there's not too many companies that make different options for it, right? And so with this setup, you have way more options to make the build, the look, the style that you like. And then of course have the cheek weld and the padding, everything. You have more limitless options. Now, speaking of the cheek weld, right, we talked earlier about how the in-tank is not beneficial to the riser of the optic, right? So with the remote line, you can use a shorter riser, and so you don't have to, some people like the looks of having a shorter riser. It looks less bulky, less unsightly on your marker, so that's a bonus. Okay. Now, of course, some of the cons, like we talked about, is of course primarily the snagging issue with the remote line, right? The extra weight that you have to deal with, because now you're carrying a tank, remote line, fittings, all these ounces are going to add up to pounds. And then of course your pouch as well on your vest. And then like I said, just the hassle of having to disconnect the marker, having to, remove this tank when you need to go get it filled, versus just handing your marker, right? Like a marker like this, super light, super convenient. You just hand it to the air fill station guy or gal. They hook up the nipple, fill it up, you're good to go. Right, this one, if your nipple here is not easily accessible, you're gonna have to take it out of your pouch, remove your gear, have one of your teammates help you do that because you can't reach around the back to get it out, or you're gonna have to turn around and like I said, it's just more of a hassle to get these filled up. And then we talked about the maneuverability issue, right? Switching shoulders, getting in the way of your slings, maybe getting in the way of your transition when you drop your marker and transition to your backup marker. Of course, more issues to go wrong. If you use quality components like this Pro Connect 3 here, you tape thread, or paste your threads, and you make sure that they don't come loose. I rarely have any issues with them, but once again, it's just another thing to go wrong, right? So if the Pro Connect fitting or your airline fitting starts leaking, it's one more thing to service, one more thing to deal with. If this valve goes bad as well too, because you're constantly having to screw or unscrew it, that can go bad as well. Just one more thing to service. Now, real quick about airing and and unairing, right? Disconnecting and connecting your marker to the air source. If you don't use a quick connect fitting like this Pro Connect 3 here, or like one of those slide check fittings, it's a real pain in the butt to disconnect your marker, right? Because with the normal airline fitting like we have here on the 468, when it's not aired up, right, when this thing isn't under pressure and you haven't opened the release valve yet, it's gonna be easy to connect the fittings together. But once you air it up, now the air pressure is gonna really make it difficult for you to release those fittings. And then the other thing is when it's under pressure, to go turn it off, right, to go use this valve to turn it off, that threads on the valve is under pressure from the air pressure. And so it's going to be really tight, and if you're not careful, a lot of usage can wear down and damage those threads, and then it's going to necessitate that you replace this component here. Okay, so just be aware of that. The quick disconnect fitting will kind of alleviate that. That'll help you from having to wear this down that much. So to me, it's a must. This quick QD fitting, okay? The other thing too, I've noticed a lot of the air through stock fittings like this is that they are kind of loosely attached. So as you can see here, that there's literally just a lock nut that will secure the buffer tube, right, once you have it in the right position. So obviously, you want to line up the buffer tube so the stock is up and down. If not, it's going to be like cockeyed to one side. And once you have it lined up, you need to lock it down with this lock nut. But unless you go wrench it down, unless you go, of course, Loctite it or thread paste it, it can come loose during play. Especially, right, if you have the sling attached to these points here. Any pressure on that thing is going to rotate the stock. So just another thing to be aware of, it doesn't lock down like just a click down lock or held in place by an actual secured method like a real AR. So just remember that this thing can come loose, right? So another kind of con when it comes to that. All right. And then the other thing, of course, is we need to discuss is cost, right? An in-tank setup, you just buy a tank, whatever size you have, 60 bucks, 70 bucks, done deal, right? The air through the setup is going to require this buffer tube, air through setup. That's going to be a cost. And then if your marker, like an EMF or a TMC or a Stormer, didn't have that, then you're gonna need to buy the conversion kit to do that. And you still need to buy the buffer tube, right? And then of course you're gonna have to buy a bigger tank and a remote line setup. And you know, if you're gonna go this route, why would you buy a small tank, right? The whole point of going to this setup is to purchase a bigger tank so that way you don't have to refill as often. And of course, the pro of it as well too, but the con, like we said, is cost. But a pro that will give it to it is that you can use it for certain gameplays. One is box mags, right? Most box mags are gonna hold about 200 to 250 rounds, 250 usually, right? And so with the 13 CI tank or 10 CI tank, you're not gonna be able to fire a box mag, especially if you're planning to run full auto in one of these markers, right? You're not going to be able to go through a box mag with just a 10 CI or 13 CI tank. So you're going to be required to run a remote line setup. And then like I was saying earlier, right? Big gameplays, big scenario events where, you know, there's less air stations for you to fill up. Okay, but that's the pros and cons of each different setup, guys, right? So what do you guys use out there? Do you guys prefer the remote line setups to get that absolute realistic slimline look without having to use the big riser, but then of course add additional components to your loadout? Or do you guys like the, you know, in-tank setups where your marker is just completely free and clean and easy to maneuver, but of course, you know, have less air and more of a hassle to go get aired up? Okay guys, hey, hopefully that video, this video kind of helped you guys out, give you guys some more information to think about, figure out what setup you want to do before you guys go out on the field and play, and of course hopefully help you guys, you know, work out any bugs or work out any issues you guys might have with the different setups like optics and everything else. Guys, hey, appreciate it, love you guys as always, check you guys next time, peace.